I recognize the member from Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Speaker, and I am pleased to be able to stand and get a chance to put some thoughts on the record here as we're debating a time allocation motion, another heavy-handed tactic of this government to, unfortunately, to stifle debate. In fact, we just saw in this legislature the government move to adjourn the debate and ring the bells for half an hour to further cut into the limited time that has been allocated for any type of discussion on this time allocation motion. So I'll briefly explain what this time allocation motion is about. But then there are some other issues that we would like to raise about the bills that are included in this time allocation motion. So here we are discussing something that I haven't seen in my 9.5 years. And while I've seen time allocation motions, the Liberals love them, but this government has perfected them. They are just such an overreach and such a heavy-handed measure. And in this case, this is a time allocation motion that addresses or deals with 3 separate bills. Generally speaking, a time allocation motion is one bill at a time. But here we see that pursuant to Standing Order 50 and notwithstanding any other standing order or special order of the House relating to Bill 136, which is an act to amend the Greenbelt Act, and certain other acts to enact the Duffins Rouge Agricultural Preserve Act 2023. And Speaker, you'll remember that's the bill that the Premier so eloquently said people didn't give 2 hoots about. Right. However, at committee, the committee room was packed with people who weren't even allowed to speak because Bill 136, while it didn't allow public engagement, gave the replacement Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing the only time of anyone to speak was for the minister, which is also unusual. But anyway, here we are, back to the time allocation motion, which addresses Bill 136 about the Greenbelt and Duffins Rouge Agricultural Preserve Act, and also Bill 150, an act to enact the Official Plan Adjustments Act, and also Bill 154, which is the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act. All of those 3 bills are pulled into this time allocation motion. And a time allocation motion, for the folks at home who are wondering what we're talking about, a time allocation motion, it gives the government a tool to do something other than what is normal flow and process of this space. So a bill usually, when it gets tabled, it comes for second reading, folks debate it. When it reaches its end of debate time, goes to committee where hopefully it is thoughtfully addressed, maybe amended as needed, and then it comes out the other side for third reading where we're supposed to debate an amended piece of legislation or whatnot, and then it passes. But the time allocation motion says nope, says we're going to skip those steps, we don't want those steps, and in this case, Bill 136, the Greenbelt, the bill that deals with the Greenbelt, which is of significant interest to folks, and Bill 150 is the act to enact the Official Plan Adjustments Act. Both of those bills will get 1 hour of debate when they come back to this House for third reading, divided amongst the parties. That's it, that's all, folks, okay? But what's interesting is that third piece of legislation that I'm looking forward to talking a bit about today, Bill 154, when it's next called, it says the Speaker shall immediately put every question necessary to dispose of the second reading stage of the bill without further debate or amendment. So basically just whoosh, it's gone. Then Bill 154 shall be ordered for third reading all of a sudden without committee. And then when the order for third reading is called, the Speaker shall put every question necessary to dispose of the third reading stage of the bill without further debate or amendment, and then no deferral on any votes on these bills. So basically it is just to take it, throw it through the process and out the other side without the opportunity for folks to debate or discuss. And that is highly problematic. Like when we put up our hands to run for election, we think we're going to come to this space and debate thoughtfully, maybe do some homework from time to time, really get into the work of this place. But I find it interesting that the government members don't seem to be upset about the prospect of skipping all of those legislative steps in order to rush things without public access, without thoughtful consideration. I don't understand, but they're the ones who have to sleep at night, so hopefully they have found a way. But, Speaker, that's what we're here talking about is this government time allocation motion. And Bill 154, which this motion has said will not be getting committee hearings, will not be going to third reading and back before this House to debate, Bill 154, that is the Ontario, that's the Ontario Place redevelopment stuff. Yeah. So this government lately has been operating under a huge cloud of suspicion for all sorts of things. Right now they're under criminal investigation by the RCMP. The government keeps, during question period when this comes up, they point to the Liberals and remind the Liberals of their former chief of staff that went to jail. And I think, and this premier's like, David Livingston, here, hold my beer, right? Like they're just, everything they do is under a cloud of suspicion. You're under active criminal investigation by the RCMP. First of all, not a good look, but not a good practice. Like there are steps that have been taken to get to this point. And I raise that because this bill is about Ontario Place and the redevelopment, and there are so many questions about Ontario Place, and here we are rushing through the process so that bill can't go to committee. Why not? Exactly. Who is this government afraid to hear from? Do you not think that it would be a packed house at that committee room?
Yes, it would.
Well, why wouldn't you want to find out? What on earth do Ontarians have to say about Ontario Place? Let's ask them. Just kidding. Time allocation, there shall be no committee, there shall be no third reading. No consultation. That case is closed. It is happening. We have a minister for mega spas and a legacy project, and we've got an unbelievable obsession with this luxury mega spa in this province, which is absurd. People cannot find affordable housing. People cannot afford to feed themselves. And while the government can talk about, their affordability measures, or their stickers on cars or what have you, real people need real solutions to really be able to get through the day and survive. Forget thrive. Right now people are looking to get by. They are not making their plans, not even likely in the next 95 years, to spend a day at the luxury spa. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the minister knows something we don't. But because they are so short on details about how this is going to meet the needs of Ontarians, they're a business case that we've been begging for. And I stood in this house and I said, I don't believe she has one. Well, then we got one. Well, what a load of malarkey. Like that business case, to call it that, I think is being awfully generous, is insufficient. So, Speaker, Bill 154, which doesn't get its day in court, which doesn't get its day in committee, which doesn't get to come back for third reading because of this time allocation motion, allows the minister to do all sorts of stuff. Like the Minister of Infrastructure, whose baby this is, right? This is her legacy project, or the Premier's. I'm not sure. We don't get to really know what on earth is driving this. But the Schedule 2 of this bill enacts the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act. It gives the government extraordinary powers over the Ontario Place redevelopment. It gives them legal indemnifications that go much further than previous bills to fast-track construction projects, and much further than previous bills. It is an overreach. Again, this allows the Minister of Infrastructure to issue ministers' zoning orders. Why? It gives this Minister of Infrastructure the power to unilaterally rewrite Toronto's official plan with respect to the Ontario Place site. The minister can ignore the provincial policy statement and provincial plans. The Environmental Assessment Act does not apply to any undertaking at the Ontario Place site or any infrastructure projects outside the Ontario Place site that further the Ontario Place redevelopment, including water or sewage projects, highway projects, or parking facilities. The Environmental Assessment Act does not apply, and this government thinks it doesn't deserve time in committee. This time allocation motion says there will be no third reading debate. Speaker, the Ontario Heritage Act does not apply to the Ontario Place site or to any buildings or structures on the site. Cabinet can prescribe land, buildings or structures within the Ontario Place site to which the Ontario Heritage Act does apply, which may include the Cinesphere and the pods, may or may not. The Ontario Heritage Act does not apply to the Ontario Place site or any of its buildings. Well, it used to, and now it doesn't. And I believe that the minister who would be making the decisions around which parts are heritage and which parts aren't is the minister responsible for heritage, even though it's not in his portfolio title, because they've rebranded all of the ministerial or the ministries, and it's Minister of Citizenship and Multiculturalism. We don't even say the word heritage anymore, but he gets to decide. It's the minister's nephew, Minister for Citizenship and Multiculturalism, who gets to decide which parts are worth it, I guess. What a load of nonsense. So here is from the article. No, excuse me. I'm going to read more about heritage. The Architectural Conservancy Ontario strongly opposes the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act. And I will note that our critic, responsible for heritage, among other things, oh, hi, nice to have you here, is not only keeping me company, but has been raising this in this House. And we still haven't heard anything from the government. And these folks, I'm willing to bet, would have loved to have come to committee, would have loved to have come to committee. But what they have said is, regarding Bill 154, to plough ahead with developing the highly criticized Therma Spa, the Ontario Heritage Act says the Ontario government would need to prove this development would not harm the cultural significance and heritage value of this internationally renowned site. For months, Architectural Conservancy Ontario has been saying the Ontario Heritage Act won't permit this to happen. Rather than argue their proposal to cut down 850 trees and build a mega spa does not undermine the designated heritage features of Ontario Place, an argument they would surely lose, rather than play according to the rules the provincial legislature passed for the protection of Ontario's cultural heritage, this government just says we'll change the rules. They go on to say in their press release, not only that, we'll give our Minister of Infrastructure the right to make up her own rules via ministerial zoning orders as she goes. By exempting Ontario Place from the protection of the Ontario Heritage Act, the Rebuilding Ontario Place Act not only threatens one of Canada's most important contributions to modern design, it threatens all provincially owned heritage properties. If the Ontario Heritage Act can be tossed aside for such a frivolous, irresponsible project that Ontarians clearly do not want, and that will embarrass us all in front of the world, then all provincially owned heritage properties are at risk. Where is the minister responsible for the protection of Ontario's heritage in all this? Ever since he was appointed, ACO has been trying to meet Minister Ford. To date, we haven't even had any acknowledgement of our requests. The Architectural Conservancy of Ontario deplores this act of cowardice. And that is from the media release regarding Bill 154. That's the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario. Speaker, these are folks who would have loved a chance to come to committee, but they don't get to have that chance because this government, in its heavy-handed time allocation motion, says nobody's allowed to weigh in. I wonder why. Also regarding Bill 154, John Lawrence has written, In it, the province regifts itself powers it already has, enlarges loopholes it had already created, and effectively guts the provisions of any kind of environmental or heritage oversight as they might apply to this tiny yet contentious corner of Ontario. It's difficult to think of another instance when a government made the conditions for a private sector company quite as easy as these Tories have done in this spot. Subsidies? Check. Enabling infrastructure? Check. Regulatory approvals? Well, if you want to call them that, check. As far as I can see, writes John Lawrence, this Act also kicks the struts out from under the Ontario Place for All lawsuit, the gist of which was that Infrastructure Ontario hadn't obeyed the province's own environmental assessment rules. Given that those rules have been reversed, gutted, the logic of the application seems to fall apart. Hard to imagine how Therma could now fail to deliver what the Premier so desperately craves, a giant water's edge monument to his time in office, which will sit there like a misshapen glass boulder for time immemorial, or at least until that moment off in the middle distance when all and sundry realize that this edifice is simply too expensive to operate in a climate crisis. End quote. Speaker, folks do not support the government's move to do such irreversible harm to one of Ontario's treasures that we see at Ontario Place. And they're like this luxury spa. It's almost like a snow globe. Like, we all picture this big glass dome. Like, and the Minister of Infrastructure had the audacity, nerve, I don't know, but stood in this place when I raised that it was a 50-year-old cement structure, the Ontario Science Centre. And that minister suggested that 50 years was a long time for a building, that we all needed to acknowledge that it was 50 years was, I guess, beyond its prime. Well, Speaker, how well do we think a glass and water structure on the water's edge is going to fare after 95 years? Yeah. You know, if you're going to use logic, like, let's walk that all the way through. Speaker, I will continue with this article from John Lawrence. It says, to fully grasp the significance of this move, it's worth briefly revisiting the history of the garage. The original 2019 call for proposals made no mention of new parking. In fact, bidders were told that have to make do with whatever was on or near Ontario Place. Then Infrastructure Ontario, or someone, selects Therma, and suddenly we're talking about indoor underground parking. So, Speaker, the parking garage is its own fascinating story, its own interesting journey. And, you know, there's a lot of money that the province is throwing into this of public funds, a lot of money. And we don't have a copy of the lease. We don't get to know the details of this, which is why the Auditor General is now looking into it. So from CBC article on November 3rd, the province's Auditor General is moving ahead with a value-for-money audit of the Ford government's controversial Ontario Place redevelopment. They've also said the office would be auditing the Ontario Science Centre, which is set to be moved to the Ontario Place grounds in 2025. Premier and his government have faced considerable public opposition to their Ontario Place plan, which includes a long-term lease on the site's West Island for Austria-based company Therma to build a sprawling private indoor water park and spa. The province has earmarked some $650 million in public funds for infrastructure upgrades across the Ontario Place grounds and a new 2,000-space underground parking garage. Underground at the water's edge. Is it underwater, or do we wait and see? I don't know. What's interesting about this bill, the one that doesn't get to go to committee, the one that doesn't get to be amended, the one that doesn't get to make it to third reading, is there's a lot of protections in that bill for the government. And we've raised it in this legislature just how problematic that wording is. The government gives themselves all sorts of fund protections, and basically makes it law that they can break the law. So there's in Section 17, the no remedy part of this bill is really something else. So basically, protecting themselves if any, no-cost compensation or damages, including for loss of revenues or loss of profit, are owing or payable to any person, and no remedy, including but not limited to a remedy in contract, restitution, tort, misfeasance, bad faith, trust, or fiduciary obligation, any equitable remedy or any remedy under any statute is available to any person in connection with anything referred to in subsection against any person referred to in that subsection. Lots of words, but the key ones there are contract, restitution, tort, misfeasance, bad faith, trust, or fiduciary obligation. What on earth is that? What are you protecting yourselves from? Either what irons do you have in the fire, what is already underway, or what are your plans? Like, how is this okay? What do you need this for? Like, nobody trusts you already, and that doesn't help.
No.
So, Speaker, I do recognize, though, that we have an injunction, in the works. That here, an article from November 23rd, Jack Howan had written, "A citizens group is turning to the courts to try to trip up the Ontario Place Spa project. Ontario Place for All has asked the Superior Court for an injunction that would stop the Ford government from making progress on the Toronto waterfront project until it completes an environmental assessment of the area. Ontario Place for All is committed to using all possible avenues to hold the provincial government accountable for their actions at Ontario Place and ensuring that they follow the proper process, which would involve public consultation on the West Island," the group's co-chair, Norm de Pasquale, said at a press conference at Queen's Park on Tuesday. "The government has done an environmental assessment of the site, but it didn't take into account the creation of a mega spa and water park." What? The project was exempted since it's a private project on government land. The government members on the opposite are highlighting that, the political affiliations of folks that I'm reading about. Okay, I'm standing here as a New Democrat, and I also support that an injunction or using the courts. I would say use this building, but we can't because we have a time allocation motion that says shut her down. Says we can't go to committee, that says how dare we bring this back for discussion. So yes, people in the community, some of them are New Democrats, but I think you're probably also losing a lot of your base because there are such people as Conservatives who like to spend time at their public treasures, like Ontario Place, like the Ontario Science Centre. And I thank the member for reminding me of that. That was a good point to have made. So I had mentioned earlier about the business case and the parking garage, and I have put on the record about the process with the parking garage and this, the redevelopment of Ontario Place, because I sat at Estimates Committee, and I had the opportunity to ask the Minister for Infrastructure a number of questions. I took the opportunity to ask Michael Lindsay, the CEO of Infrastructure Ontario, all sorts of questions. I found out there that there was had been no fairness monitor in the process, which is highly unusual, but the feeling of just trust us, don't worry, it was a fair and equitable process, but no fairness monitor. That in terms of scoring of the criteria, there was no scoring. What was the criteria? But I was told, and you can review the Hansard, it was back on June 7th, 2023 at Infrastructure Estimates, that there were folks in the room who discussed it. I asked who the folks in the room were, and it was like, oh, well, we'll take that back and see if we can provide that to the committee. Still waiting. That's how business gets done? Like, that's wild. And something else that I will go back in time, here's the question that I asked about Mark Saunders. And some of you may remember that Mark Saunders had been the, special advisor, or whatever his title was.
No advice.
Special advisor on Ontario Place, and he made $70,000 for the year and 4 months that he was employed as the special advisor on Ontario Place. And I asked, can we have copies of the reports or recommendations from Mark Saunders as a special advisor on Ontario Place redevelopment? And the minister said, he fulfilled that role. We can take that back and respond. And I said, I'll take from that there were reports or recommendations from his work. And the minister said, it was largely before my time as minister. My understanding is his preliminary role was really to be a liaison with the City of Toronto. And I asked, were there formal recommendations or reports? If so, can we have them? And Mr. Michael Robertson said, my name is Michael Robertson. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Ontario Place Redevelopment Secretariat in the Ministry of Infrastructure. As the Minister has said, Mr. Saunders was a special advisor on the project and provided his advice directly to government. The Ministry does not have any reports that he may have made. As for his contract with the government, this was through an order in council. We can get that information and provide it to the committee. Guys, like, this is how business gets done? Like, he's a liaison. He's not responsible for producing anything. He gets 70 grand for a year and 4 months of what? Like, yeah, no, well, you'd have to live with yourself and, do nothing. I don't think you could actually handle that. Like, we do things on this side, and I don't know what he was doing there, but there's nothing to show for it. And that's what we're building this case for Ontario Place on. So the business case is the next chapter that I want to talk about here. So the business case I've been begging for quite some time. I'm the critic for infrastructure in the province, and I had asked why the Ontario Science Centre needs to be moved to Ontario Place. And Speaker, there's no rationale that has been thus provided. I've looked at the business case for relocating the Ontario Science Centre that they just released the other day, and here's from an article from Canadian Architect. Scratch below the surface, though, and there are some clear problems with the province's math. The new Science Centre is proposed to sit on top of a 2,000-space underground parking garage, which, if built, will cost about $500 million. If the parking moves to a different location, the Science Centre will need to build its own basement and foundations at a cost of perhaps some hundreds of millions of dollars. Beyond this, it also excludes the cost for a 150-metre-long underground two-level link between the new science pavilion on the mainland and the bridge to the pods, an enormously expensive component of the project due to its proximity to the waterfront, and an essential element for allowing ticketed visitors to move from the main science pavilion to the pods and cinespheres, but just not included, just not there. On the other side of the equation, the Science Centre's required repairs result from the government's choosing not to invest in the building over many years. Someone will need to pay for those repairs eventually should the building continue to be used, either as a cultural building or for another purpose. If it survives, the province is saving money by dumping perhaps $300 million in liabilities on the city. It's a shell game, nothing more, they write. The business case's costing for the relocated Ontario Place omits the costing for the rehabilitation of the pods and cinesphere. It's just not in there. Just don't talk about it. As well as the cost for building the underground science link shown in the site plan above and detailed in the test fit documents as a two-story underground link. It doesn't include most of the renovations to the heritage pods, including the $25.5 million currently being spent on recladding those structures. And also, there's a human cost to the math. The government's case for relocating the Ontario Science Centre is strongly based on the efficiencies of a smaller facility, but also on its ability, paradoxically, to attract more visitors. It estimates that 1.15 million people will visit the relocated Science Centre in its first years. It also expects to accrue cost savings through staffing reductions. The estimates count on laying off 53 people, or 1 out of every 6 people who currently work at the Science Centre. For the people, eh? Of course, it's not surprising that the business case contorts itself in an attempt to justify the relocation. It goes on to say the provincial government had already determined more than 2 years before any public announcement that it was determined to relocate the Ontario Science Centre to Ontario Place. The business case was specifically constructed to justify this decision. While we may take it for granted, there is value in taking care of what we have. A magnificent, much-loved museum at the Ontario Science Centre that is in need of some TLC. The value of such a gem isn't something we usually quantify, but if we did, in a neutral way that accounted for cultural value, economic value, social value, and sustainability, it's clear how the business case would land. Well, that was a thoughtful piece by the Canadian Architect. But basically, when we have looked at the mess that has been this process, the need for FOIs, the need to try and get answers at committee, We have seen that this government has not been forthcoming with any actual numbers. We have seen that this is hidden, that the lease is not allowed to be for public consumption, that this bill is not allowed to go to committee. We cannot hear from people. Like, what on earth this government is hiding from? Like, you're literally hiding from the people, which is shameful. And if you think you have such buy-in, if every mother with, like, single mom with 3 kids that the Minister for Infrastructure talks about all the time, that she just wants a day at the wellness centre, she wants to be able to feed her kids. She wants her kids to go to school and have the supports that they need. She wants a place that she can afford. She wants rent control, in all likelihood. Look, I'm sure that everybody could use a day at the spa, but I don't think that this is what this is about. And we don't know anything about the deal. I know that I have stood in this legislature and asked how on earth we can, what the government can point to ensure that the financing is even there. Therma has made promises all around the world, pledging to spend billions on new luxury spas. Therma promised to invest $350 million in Ontario, but we have seen that it's Ontario taxpayers that are going to be paying $650 million for a new parking garage, new water infrastructure, and other site prep for public land that Therma is going to be in control of for 95 years. I wonder if spas are still going to be a thing in 95 years. Maybe. Like, is this honestly, is this like the fountain of youth? Because with the way that this Minister of Mega Spas or Minister of Infrastructure is like all about this project, like, what's in the water? Because 95 years is a really long time, and a really long time when Ontarians don't get to see the numbers, don't get to see the lease. And Therma was on the brink of bankruptcy only 3 years ago. We don't even know if they actually have the money. 95 years is a long time for a company that barely made it through the decade. So we've asked the Premier, I stood in this House and I asked the government to prove to the public that any due diligence has been done to confirm the source of Therma's financing. Crickets. And not to say crickets are financing it. Saying that's all that we've heard is nothing. Nothing. Like, you don't have to justify yourself to anyone. No committee. No answers. We're not the boss of you. We get it. But you still are the government in the province of Ontario, and you owe Ontarians some kind of accountability. A lot of other folks have been looking into Therma's financing, and it is a convoluted, tangled, interesting web. And it's 4 pages of who knows who and all of the different, but it says, I will read this piece also from John Lawrence. He had examined how the company behind Ontario Place Mega Spa makes money. He says, what's apparent from the company's nested corporate and philanthropic relationship is that it is exceptionally well connected to the worlds of art, philanthropy, finance, and real estate. What's less clear is the origin of Therma's capital, and in particular the funding required to build an almost $500 million facility on the West Island at Ontario Place. Given that the Ford government is executing a 95-year lease through a process overseen by Infrastructure Ontario, it would seem prudent for provincial officials to know precisely who it is dealing with and the ultimate source and terms of the firm's financing. But we don't get to know. And here we have a time allocation motion which says, shh, there's no committee. No one gets to come and ask questions. There's no third reading debate. This is the last chance that we're going to have to talk about Ontario Place in terms of a piece of legislation. Is my remaining 6 minutes to talk about the fact that I only have 6 minutes because of the time allocation motion before us. It's something else. We've got a conversation about Ontario Place and a conversation about the Ontario Science Centre. And the Ontario Science Centre is a beloved, piece of public infrastructure. People love to go there. We've had letters written in about people who've been going there for a generation. They remember going there as kids. I remember being there as a kid. Moriyama had said that with proper investment it would last over 250 years. Well, guess what? We didn't have that proper investment. And you know why? Because Infrastructure Ontario is the landlord. This province is the landlord.
I'm sorry to interrupt the member, but pursuant to Standing Order 50, I am now required to interrupt and put the question.